At the start, Coke was just a copy of a much better and more popular drink called Vin Mariani. Despite Coke containing a mixture of cocaine and caffeine, it sold poorly, barely anyone knew about it, and it was about to be forgotten forever. But then, in just 10 years, one man used shady business tactics and some of the most advanced psychological marketing techniques to turn this drink into a global sensation. And now 100 years later, Coke has become an international empire of exploitation, with the drink company now being accused of funding paramilitaries to assassinate union leaders in Colombia, sucking the poorest villagers dry of water, making the most vulnerable addicted to their products, and actually getting rid of their toxic waste by giving it to poor people as fertilizer. So how did this nameless mediocre drink become a global Coke cartel? Coca-Cola's origins as the company we know today begin with a man named Asa Griggs Candler. He was a drugstore owner, back in the day when drug prohibitions weren't really a thing, with drugs like opioids, cocaine, cannabis being as free and readily available as coffee. So when Candler met the fellow druggist John Pemberton and tried his carbonated cocaine-caffeine mixture, he immediately knew there was massive opportunity here. But Pemberton had been having trouble selling the product, despite its addictive qualities, so he tried to market it as a health product, but after years of trying, it never really got him anywhere. Candler knew Pemberton was an easy mark as well. Having been wounded in the Civil War 20 years before, Pemberton had himself become addicted to morphine to cope with the chronic pain. His addiction had left the man in poverty, making him desperate for money in his final years. And so Candler understood that this tragic figure was sitting on a gold mine, so he pressured Pemberton to sell his formula and his share of the rights to the company. Pemberton, with one foot in the grave and hoping to leave something for his only son, agreed to a measly price of just $2,300. With Pemberton dying just 1 year later, he would never know what his drink would become. In fact, according to the stories from the time, Candler finished his buyout of Coca-Cola when he bought the rights to the name from Pemberton's widow for $300, a deal which he made at Pemberton's funeral, with his widow eventually dying just days later in a mysterious house fire. And we'll never really know the true details here. Candler had all the records of the old company destroyed a couple decades later to cover his tracks. But no matter what, Coca-Cola's origins were tragic. But now that Pemberton and his ideas of a health tonic were out of the window, Candler was finally free to turn Coke into a real product. At this point, Coca-Cola wasn't being bottled yet, it was still just a syrup. Pharmacists would take deliveries of the syrup and dilute it with carbonated water, selling the resulting liquid for 5 cents a cup. And by 1892, Candler had taken this business model over and was ready to give it the boost it needed. But at first he struggled with the same issues that Pemberton had: low sales. People just weren't very interested in Coca-Cola to begin with. In fact, the drink averaged just 9 sales a day. But two things were about to launch Coca-Cola into the stratosphere, and the first of these was advertising. Candler knew the product was sound. You can't get a much more addictive product than cocaine and caffeine mixed together, so Candler understood that the main thing that he needed to do was market the product to the masses. And this is when Candler began the first mass advertising campaign of Coca-Cola's history. Anyone can find anything on the internet, including your full legal name, your personal email, your home address, phone number, and even your relatives. This information is accessible because of data brokers, who profit by selling your information to robocallers, telemarketers, spammers, and anyone else that wants to learn more about you. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura will identify data brokers that are exposing your information and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf. They'll even opt you out of junk mail and telemarketing lists. And you can use my link aura.com/moon to try 2 weeks for free and see how many data brokers are sharing your information. Also linked in my description, or scan the QR code. Aura also monitors your emails and passwords to see if they're involved in a data breach and exposed on the dark web, giving you recommendations on what to do. Aura's app also features a VPN, password manager, real-time credit, and identity theft monitoring, internet parental controls, and protects your device from malware. Aura has almost every internet safety tool you'll ever need, all inside of one app. So let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. And if you sign up right now, Aura will give you a 2-week free trial with my link. And you'll be shocked at how much of your private information Aura finds exposed over those 2 weeks. So go to aura.com/moon to start your free trial. Also linked in the description or scan the QR code. Through a relentless torrent of billboards, newspaper ads, coupons, and even signs on the back of horse-drawn carriages, Coca-Cola became impossible to avoid. The ads often focused on health benefits, but the most effective ones simply branded the drink as delicious and refreshing. After this campaign, sales immediately went through the roof, enabling Canada to expand the business indefinitely. But another factor was pushing Coca-Cola to new heights, and it really had nothing to do with Canada at all. You see, the late 1800s were the beginning of a craze in America for a movement called Temperance. Alcohol was seen by these people as a moral evil and something to be avoided entirely, which eventually led to legislated prohibition. As the movement grew, organizations like the Anti-Saloon League pushed people out of bars and taverns, but the movement paid no attention to the drug cocktails that pharmacies were selling. In fact, they were seen as a healthy alternative. which meant that instead of heading towards the saloon after work to get drunk, workers would actually go to the pharmacy to get high. And when they got there, they found the cocaine and caffeine-infused Coca-Cola on sale for just 5 cents a cup. And after their first pop, people just couldn't stop. The product was ridiculously addictive. And so in just 3 years, Coca-Cola was soon being drunk in every state in the US. And just 10 years after taking over the company, Canada's sales increased from 9,000 gallons of syrup a year to over 370,000 gallons. At this point, Coca-Cola had firmly implanted themselves in the minds of Americans, but there was now a growing pressure to remove the cocaine. So after 1903, they started processing the coca leaves to remove most of the cocaine, although trace amounts were still present until 1929, so Canada needed something to keep people drinking Coke. So we turned to a different, highly addictive white powder, sugar. Now today we all know too well the incredibly addictive and unhealthy qualities of sugar, but even just a few decades ago, this wasn't the case, and it certainly wasn't widespread knowledge in the early 20th century. It was this new combination of sugar and caffeine that spread like wildfire when mixed with Coca-Cola's massive focus on advertising. And to put into context, by 1911, Coca-Cola was spending over $1 million on advertising every year, the equivalent of $31 million today, and it was this magic formula that would remain unchanged for the next century, catalyzing Coca-Cola's growth to the top. Over the years, Coke would perfect their marketing schemes and their ability to co-opt trends. It's a common misconception that Santa Claus was green before Coke made him red. In fact, Santa was wearing red decades before Coke's first advert. Although their first attempt at festive advertising in 1931 was incredibly successful for Coke, and over the years more ad campaigns would shape Santa's image to fit their purposes. At first it helped Coke because people thought of it as a summer drink, so Santa helped convince people to nurse their Coke addictions all year long. Later on, Coke's relentless Santa marketing pushed the whole holiday away from religion and towards secular consumerism. Before, he was small enough to fit down people's chimneys and was much more elf-like, so Coke made him taller, fatter, and gave him a big white beard. And as Santa advertising ramped up, this image slowly replaced all the others. Saint Nicholas the Saint was being replaced by Coke's Santa, and this consumerist new version of the saint worked perfectly to target children. Like the tobacco company selling candy cigarettes, Coke was making sure the next generation of children would be addicted to their products. All until 1919, when Canada eventually sold the company for $25 million. And considering he only bought it for a few thousand just a few decades ago, this was one of the most lucrative deals in history, and the new owners were ready to bring Coke to the world. Over the 1920s, Coke became widespread in places like the UK, France, and later Germany, and their sponsorship deal for the 1928 Olympics helped strengthen the brand internationally. But just like in the beginning, Coca-Cola were always ready to exploit any opening they could find. And that was when Coke came to Germany around 1929, in which they exploded in popularity. And by the time that Adolf Hitler had come to power in 1933, sales were already at 100,000 cases of Coke a year. Still a modest figure, but a clear foothold. And if Coke wanted to dominate the competition, they needed to have a strong foothold on all the countries in the world. And so they embraced the new regime, happily complying with Nazi regulations. In fact, they eagerly supplied huge amounts of Coke to the 1936 Berlin Olympics, and later sent sales teams to Nazi political rallies. Even when the war started, Coca-Cola didn't want to lose their market. They tried to skirt trade embargoes for a time, but eventually they weren't allowed to import any more syrup to the fascist nation. So instead, Coke would make a new drink called Fanta, using waste products that were common in heavily rationed Germany at the time. Even when every other food and drinks were heavily rationed, Fanta was still everywhere. And by 1939, there were 43 bottling plants in Nazi Germany. And later on in 1943, there were 3 million cases being sold in Germany alone. But once the war ended, the Coca-Cola company fell back into place and completely stopped production of Fanta and went straight back to Coke again. But playing both sides wasn't the only way Coca-Cola profited of the war. In fact, World War II was one of the best things to happen to Coca-Cola, as when war was declared by the USA in 1941, Coke was ready and waiting with a genius marketing move. It was going to be costly, but Coca-Cola's president at the time made an announcement that every serviceman would be able to buy a Coke for just 5 cents a bottle. Now, by doing this, Coke would lose a ton of money, rolling out the infrastructure necessary for this. But eventually, in the long term, this was going to be worth it. It would make the entire US addicted to Coke, and it allowed the company to send Coke around the world. Where the troop convoys went, Coke followed. Then the US government got involved, helping Coca-Cola set up even more overseas factories and infrastructure with taxpayer money. They even let Coca-Cola field special representatives in US military uniform. These so-called Coke colonels spread Coke to the entire military, and the soldiers helped spread it to the local population. And so by finding this opportunity in World War II, Coke had given themselves an international distribution network, partially funded by Uncle Sam. And over the next few decades, the emergency wartime factories and bottling plants were converted into permanent civilian operations. Everywhere the US had been, Coke gained a foothold. They used them to spread into the rest of the world. And in a world that wasn't really used to high sugar diets, it was like Coke was still using the old cocaine recipe. Even though Coke was still absolutely massive in the USA and was still growing, international expansion started to outpace domestic gains. So by the late 1950s, overseas sales made up a third of revenue and Coca-Cola had spread to over 100 countries. And this was helped along by Coke's signature brand-focused advertising. You see, unlike traditional marketing, Coke's always focused on making sure that the brand name and logo were omnipresent. Simple logos and scantily clad pin-up girls were often the only things in the advert. And it was this strategy that had worked so well in the US that helped cement Coke's name abroad. Meanwhile, in the US, Coke was always innovating on advertising. Their advert, "I'd like to buy the world of Coke," was possibly the most groundbreaking advert of all time. By exploiting cultural shifts, their international presence and a focus on brand over substance, Coke had then made one of the best adverts of all time. But not all of Coke's marketing techniques have been so obvious. Now, despite the claims to the contrary, Coke has been working on covert techniques in order to get kids addicted early on. Their co-option of Santa Claus is just one part of this. Other cuddly Coke mascots like the signature polar bears help toe the line. However, Coke ads don't appear on specifically directed children's TV. Oftentimes this is against the law, so Coke has always had to think outside the box to get kids addicted, which is why Coke targets things like theme parks and even schools. In fact, Coke is found in school vending machines around the world. Coke specifically signs contracts with schools to ensure that they only sell Coke's products in place of healthier alternatives. Some schools are even offered bonuses based on how many Cokes they sell to children, incentivizing the education system to addict as many children as possible to Coke. And by taking advantage of how underfunded and poor so many schools are, they have then secured the next generation of Coca-Cola addicts. And Coke is also constantly lobbying governments to either keep the status quo in check or even extend their reach. I mean, leaked emails between top Coke executives have revealed Coke's grand strategy to beat new sugar taxes and get past the flimsy red tape. All of these measures are designed to instill a lifelong sugar addiction in children, with Coke even going as far as buying out Columbia Pictures just to get around advertising laws. Just recently, a whistleblower has released staggering new information on the death of Coke's conspiracy. If the American obesity rates were listed on the stock exchange, everyone would be buying, as they've steadily increased ever since mass sugar consumption began. Today, over 40% of Americans are obese, and a further 30% are overweight. But there's a reason that people keep getting fatter whilst nothing changes. You see, it's much more profitable for food and pharmaceutical giants to sell quick fix band-aid solutions instead for the very problem that they're creating. The American Academy of Pediatrics, which decides prescription guidelines for the entire country, has recommended that everyone over 12 who's obese should be prescribed medication. Severely obese children should also be put in for bariatric surgery, the complications of which can be life-threatening. Unsurprisingly, the American Academy of Pediatrics is mostly funded by the same pharmaceutical companies who sell the medication. And Coke actually rigged the system by paying off the American Academy of Pediatrics to pay the American Diabetes Association to silence facts on how damaging Coke really is for children.
Did you know that once they blagged it so that Coca-Cola got recommended to children, like kids can drink Coca-Cola, it's good for you.
But there was competition now. The only reason people don't pay attention to Coca-Cola's monopoly is that it's a two-horse race. Pepsi started later than Coke and struggled to gain ground on the giant at first. Multiple bankruptcies during the early 20th century meant that they were playing catch-up for decades, but they finally began to even the playing field in the 1960s after a lucrative merger, and the market share started moving in their favor. But lots of the new Pepsi customers were former Coke customers, and the rise of Pepsi was costing Coke their entire monopoly. Then later on, the competition got even more direct. In one of the greatest campaigns of all time, Pepsi created the Pepsi Challenge. The idea was to showcase people choosing Pepsi over Coke after a blind taste test, and it worked. By 1983, Coke's market share had been significantly eroded. It looked like Pepsi was going to overtake Coke once and for all, so Coke needed a dramatic response, and this is when they launched their ad campaigns calling out Pepsi, resulting in the rivalry known as the Coke Wars. Now, clearly any ad that convinces a Pepsi customer to switch brands would be a win for Coke and vice versa, but there was a second reason Coke and Pepsi were happy to slug it out in newspapers and on TV. By only talking about each other, both of the companies make it seem like there are only two options, Coke or Pepsi. In these terms, the other competitors aren't even worth talking about. It's not collusion in the traditional sense, it's still an adversarial relationship, but it does help ensure the survival of both brands and their monopolies. However, despite this, Coke's falling market share was historic. Coke had never faced such a struggle before, and if they didn't do something fast, Coke could soon become irrelevant, and so eventually they found their perfect solution in a new product. So-called New Coke was sweeter, cheaper to make, and beat the old Coke and Pepsi in blind tests. Diet Coke was also sucking away regular Coke's customers, so it looked like the traditional beverage was on the way out. So Coke's upper management made the drastic decision of phasing out old Coke entirely. Within months, new Coke was everywhere, and old Coke was finishing production. However, this backfired almost immediately. After years of ad campaigns and cultural entanglement, the sudden absence of old Coke led to outrage, and suddenly sales dramatically dropped, which is why only a few months after the decision, Coke brought it back and started making old Coke again, with new Coke dwindling in popularity, eventually being renamed and then completely discontinued. The only legacy it left was a failure and a warning not to try and fix what isn't broken. Paradoxically though, while new Coke was a complete failure, it did give old Coke a much needed boost once it was reintroduced. This rubber band effect was so big that people even accused Coke of framing the whole thing as a marketing stunt, but there's not really any evidence for this. However, even with this disaster, Coke's overall market share was over 40%, and it stayed in this dominant position all throughout the 90s and 2000s, and it was from there that they cemented their position at the top of the industry. Which is why by the 90s, Coke's market share was now over 40% and has stayed in a dominant position ever since. Along with Pepsi, they control a massive global monopoly on soft drinks. But now that they've scaled up to the highest position possible, the company now only faces two problems: maintaining their monopoly and suppressing the truth about their product. Because just like the tobacco industry and drug cartels, Coca-Cola's empire has been built on addiction. In fact, a 2008 study on sugar's addictive potential gives us the unsettling truth. It examined four main attributes that make something addictive: patterns of binging, withdrawal symptoms, and cravings. That's why when rats were exposed to sugar intermittently, they developed all three of these behaviors as a result of changes in brain chemistry. And those same processes that occur from dopamine abuse from hard drugs are also very present in sugar consumption. The global addiction was harder to detect when the effects weren't so obvious, but they are becoming obvious now. Skyrocketing obesity rates over the past few decades have made it harder to ignore. However, Coca-Cola always had a plan for this. Along with other big players in the food and drinks industry, they worked for years to hide the truth about sugar addiction. That's why all these big sugar companies like Coke have always pushed the narrative that fat is the real problem to health, not sugar. And despite little evidence for these claims, it became an accepted fact. Lobbying and getting friendly with government officials helped seal the deal. Then when people finally began to catch on after all the low-fat products didn't really work, Coca-Cola moved on to denying it entirely. They pumped millions of dollars into research that cherry-picks examples to try and prove that there's no causation. And once these stilted and biased studies came out, Coca-Cola then used them to argue against the obvious health consequences of sugar, with the end result of all of this being a massive loss in the quality and duration of many people's lives. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cancer are just a few of the very dangerous side effects of Coca-Cola's products, conditions which have taken decades of life of millions of people's life expectancy. These negative health effects also disproportionately affect impoverished people who don't have much of a choice or the education to know what they're getting into. But to maintain their monopoly, Coke has had to do more than just protecting their addictive product. Their more recent history has been characterized by a pattern of snuffing out potential competitors before they can get a foothold, with Coke destroying local competition by any means necessary. I mean, in some cases, they've even been accused of funding murder to keep their costs low. Drinks and beverages unions in Colombia accused Coca-Cola of funding death squads to assassinate key members of the union, alleging their connection to a spree of paramilitary killings over the course of 13 years. Lots of targets were directly involved in Coca-Cola bottling plants and their unions, so taking them out of the picture is clearly beneficial for the soft drinks giant. Colombia also saw the world's highest rates of union killings at the time. I mean, in 2000, 128 union representatives were murdered in Colombia, so it would be very easy for Coke to get involved. However, the actual evidence is spotty, and it can't be unequivocally proved, as the court case between Coca-Cola's involvement with these union leaders was thrown out of both the US's and Colombia's legal systems. But what is provable is Coca-Cola's awful record in Mexico. In fact, Mexico is the perfect case study for how Coca-Cola behaves when given free hand to act as they please. In Chiapas, one of the poorest areas of Mexico, the problem is at its worst. On average, people from Chiapas drink over 2 liters of Coke every day. That's over 1,600 bottles of Coke a year. So it's not hard to see why Coke is everywhere. From the smaller shops to the larger superstores, they all sell Coke. Adding in water insecurity, poor infrastructure and rationing, and you get this dystopic situation where Coke is easier to find than water. In fact, it's so entrenched in the culture that it's even been incorporated into some religious ceremonies. And Mexico's federal taxes on sugary drinks don't help after Coke slashed prices across the board. And they can afford to as long as they can keep everyone addicted. And where Coke goes, eventually diabetes follows. Over 3,000 people die every year from the condition in Chiapas. But it's not just Chiapas that's been affected. Coca-Cola has gotten its claws into the highest levels of government. Vicente Fox, Mexico's president from 2000 to 2006, even worked for Coca-Cola before he got into politics, eventually becoming regional head of the company. And it's these connections to the government that have allowed Coca-Cola to maintain its iron grip on the country. And you could say that at least Coca-Cola has given people something to drink when water is scarce, but it's often the case that they're the ones ones causing water shortages and high prices in the first place. Even from the outset, making Coke is a reductive process. It takes 3 liters of water to make each liter of Coke, and this problem is at its worst in India, when a Coke bottling plant opened up in the village of Kaladera in 2000. At first it was seen as a boost to the local economy, but almost straight away the desert village's precarious water supply was being depleted. Water levels, which had been stable for years, suddenly plummeted. Wells dried up and farmers often couldn't get enough water to irrigate their crops. The entire community was nearly abandoned before the problem was brought under control. And the same story has repeated itself across other communities in India. In Black Mada, it only took 6 months for Coke to destroy the ecosystem. You see, when it opened in 1998, Coca-Cola's plant sucked up 500,000 liters of water every day, forcing the poorest people in the world for miles around to abandon their crops and homes. And then to make things even worse, to get rid of the toxic waste made in the production process, Coca-Cola distributed it to the villagers for use as a fertilizer. And when samples of the sludge were tested, they had incredibly high levels of toxic metals like lead and cadmium. All of the damages added up to nearly $30 million, and the people living there today still need to have their water supply delivered because of this contamination. And although the factory eventually closed in 2004, Coca-Cola still hasn't paid a cent in reparations or damages to the victims. And in fact, there's probably a reason you never heard of this. All the major shareholders in Coke would never want this getting out, and these are the same people who control the media, the governments, the press. And that's also why you probably haven't heard the massive amount of pollution Coke has given to the ocean. In fact, Coca-Cola is the worst company in the world when it comes to filling the ocean with plastic trash. In a survey of over 475,000 pieces of ocean trash collected, Coke made the largest portion of any brand, followed by Nestle and Pepsi. They're also the largest contributors to the million-plus plastic bottles that are bought every minute of every day. Barely any are recycled, and a large proportion end up drifting in the ocean for years. Now, Coke's response to this has mainly been surface level and designed for the cameras. Their promises to use recycled plastics in their bottles by 2025 or use 50% recycled packaging by 2030 really ring hollow when you consider their track record. In 1990, for example, they promised that 25% of the plastic in their bottles would be made from recycled plastic, and 30 years later, this is still only 10%. And even if they do finally follow through, it will only mean that Coke is polluting the world at a slower pace than they were before. It won't do anything to solve the actual problem inherent in selling billions and billions of single-use plastic bottles every year. But this single-use plastic problem that's ravaging the world's oceans is symptomatic of Coke's whole business model, exploiting sugar. By lobbying governments and funding biased studies, Coke were able to exploit sugar's addictive and harmful properties for years. But now with the resulting obesity and diabetes epidemic, it's so much harder to ignore, and we can only hope that people keep waking up to the dangers of sugar. But Coke has already started working on a plan B. Although they aren't working on it yet, Coke has been sitting on the idea of using CBD and other cannabinoids in their drinks for some time now. And when weed finally becomes federally legal, the doors will be open to all sorts of experiments in this field. If Coke finds out that by adding some certain cannabis compounds their drink becomes more addictive, you can be sure they'll find a way to add it in. Similarly, Coke has been moving towards alcoholic beverages for exactly the same reason. They've already partnered with the company behind Jack Daniels, and they're making even more ventures into this area every single day. Because sugar isn't addictive enough, they now need drugs and alcohol. And if the backlash behind sugar continues, Coke will throw the whole weight behind alcohol and weed. In fact, this could weirdly be the new face of the Coca-Cola cartel, going back to their original roots of selling drugs. And if the history of Coke has taught us anything, it's that they'll always be ready to exploit addiction in the masses, all with the might of the world's governments and the most powerful men on Wall Street, doing collectively whatever's necessary to keep their stranglehold on society.